All right. How's it, everyone? This is Hoala Greevy again, and we are starting our next presentation with James Plouffe. This one will be about zero trust, and we've heard zero trust come up. In fact, just our last presentation by Dave Legault. So it's a great segue for us. So I just want to say a big thank you to our sponsors, our platinum sponsor, HITRUST Alliance, and our gold sponsors, Beyond LLC, Goodwin, and HIPAA Ready. I will be monitoring the Q&A section. So if you've got questions, put them in the chat room and I'll make sure to get them answered. And now I'll just do a quick introduction. So James has 20 years of experience in IT and security, and his current role at ATTACKIQ involves developing strategic technology integration solutions with the goal of helping companies improve their capabilities through the use of the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. His previous experience includes 7 years as a strategic technologist and lead solutions architect at mobile and cloud security company MobileIron, as well as a decade as a network and security architect where he handled LAN, WAN, and perimeter security infrastructure. James has also served, which I find quite interesting, as a technical consultant for seasons 1 through 3 of the award-winning hacker drama, Mr. Robot, where he used his technical expertise to provide writers with real-world examples and situations of how the attacks portrayed in the show would unfold in reality. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to James. Thank you for joining us, James.
Thank you, Hoala, and I just want to extend a special thank you to the entire Powbox team, including you and Chloe and Rick, for the opportunity to be here today. Just a little bit more about me. As Hoala said, I'm a senior partner solutions architect at ATTACKIQ, and I try to make the gears mesh between our platform and other security tools. In my spare time, I enjoy backpacking, scuba diving, and trying to resuscitate old houses. Or rather, I don't know if I enjoy that last one so much, but I seem to spend a lot of time doing it, so there we are. I also like pretzels and root beer. So one other quick note, I do want to thank my employer, ATTACKIQ. They're gracious enough to let me appear at these sorts of things. And so for those of you not familiar with what they do, they are in the breach and attack simulation market, and they provide a security optimization platform. And that is the last you're going to hear about them today. But if you'd like to learn more, please reach out to me. We're happy to tell you a little bit more about what we do over there. So I think this quote kind of captures what brings us together. It's from a book called Thinking in Systems by Donella H. Meadows. And I think it's as true as it's ever been, that everything is connected to everything else and not neatly. With everything going on with the pandemic and the sort of state of work from home, we're dealing with a lot of the same stuff. We still have endpoints, we still have networks, we still have servers and data centers. But the reality is that we have a very different sphere of control than we used to. So we may or may not own those endpoints, we may or may not operate those networks, and those servers may not be in our data centers. And so that presents a whole host of challenges for us. And with that as a backdrop, I'd like to spend some time talking a little bit today about zero trust. And to that end, what I'd like to cover is just a quick heritage and history of zero trust. Some of the key concepts, take a look at it a little bit at a high-level architecture and some of the components that are in there, try to give you some pointers on some high-level implementation considerations, and we've got some time at the end for Q&A. So if you have not heard the term zero trust before today, or you aren't completely comfortable with your understanding of what it is, or you're already planning or implementing zero trust projects, hopefully this presentation will help you along on that path. I want to take a quick moment to divert for a second here. Just like the US and the UK are separated by a common language, analysts often use different words for the same thing. So you may hear the term Carta, you may hear the term zero trust. And this is a case where I think the naming of the category is not nearly as important as the concepts, and I would encourage you not to get too wrapped up in that terminology. Or as my favorite YouTuber says, take what you like, leave what you don't. one other aside on zero trust, there's a lot of discussion in zero trust literature about machine-to-machine security, and that's certainly valuable, but it's not likely to pay the highest dividends in the short term. So definitely, as you're thinking about kind of what a zero trust strategy looks like for you, definitely keep in mind that the most immediate gains come from protecting your largest attack surface, which is usually the things your users touch. So zero trust is the latest in a long line of security buzzwords. It definitely is. I know you've heard a lot of that today. A useful approach to modern security. I hope at the end of this you will agree that it is. Is it a completely new and unprecedented way of doing things? Well, I have spent almost the last decade of my career working in Silicon Valley startups, and we often want to tell you that the latest shiny thing has never been seen before. But I can tell you in the case of zero trust, it is definitely not new. So let's talk a little bit about that heritage and where zero trust kind of comes from. I would argue actually that the start of zero trust goes all the way back to the 1980s and the Project Athena distributed computing environment at MIT. Part of distributed computing was the Kerberos protocol and the Kerberos software that underpins a lot of modern security technologies, including a lot of what you see in Windows today. And the idea was that you had this large distributed network and you needed a way to secure it. And so Kerberos was one of the first kind of applications to take a crack at that problem. In 2003, the Jericho Forum got together. They officially organized in 2004, and they published a list of the Jericho Forum commandments in 2006. It's basically a list of rules for how to deal with the security implications of increasingly connected stuff and the breakdown of perimeters and the shortcomings, in particular things like firewalls and access control lists. And to sum up the work that they did, there's another great quote from Dr. Meadows, which is, there's no single legitimate boundary to draw around a system. We have to invent boundaries for clarity and sanity, and boundaries can produce problems when we forgot that we artificially created them. And I think that really captures the spirit of what the Jericho Forum was talking about. Also in 2006, Microsoft, by way of one of their security evangelists, Jesper Johansson, started talking about something they called domain isolation. And this took advantage of the built-in IPsec stack inside of Windows to create both host-based firewalling policies as well as network traffic encryption policies that were governed through group policy, for those of you that are familiar with the kind of Windows admin constructs. I had the privilege of working at a company that attempted to implement this at least partially, and it was exactly the sort of train wreck that you would imagine. In 2009, Cisco rolled out this concept of borderless networks. Now, that was really a marketing umbrella, but it was the first time that they started to really dig into the notion of remote work, more contextual access control decisions, and incorporating mobile devices. And so there's a lot of concepts from that marketing campaign that actually, I think, also informed zero trust. In 2010, a then Forrester analyst named John Kindervag coined the term zero trust officially. And in 2014, Google released their Beyond Corp white papers, and that was really the first public zero trust reference architecture. So it's worth taking a moment here to ask ourselves whether Google was actually a bad example for technology projects, in the sense that they are unlike any company ever. They have all the money in the world. They have a massive pool of technical resources. They're also relatively young. Google was founded in 1998, so they don't have a lot of the legacy systems that a traditional environment has to deal with. For those of us that have been around IT for a while, you know that the stuff that got installed 20 years ago and is still hanging on is not necessarily going to be amenable to the latest and greatest technology, security technology. They also had the ability to dedicate 6 years to a science project, and I think that's important to remember that this was not something that they did overnight. Even with all their financial and technical resources, it took them 6 years to get to where they were willing to talk about it publicly, and they still had work to do at that time. Now, it turns out, I think, that Google is also sort of a good example in that I have it on good authority from some folks who were there at the time that Google is just like every other company ever in that they have the same sort of problems with different stakeholders and competing priorities and the usual array of layer 8 issues and constraints that affect all of us in our day-to-day. A couple other important works, Zero Trust Networks by Evan Gilman and Doug Barth was published in July 2017, and NIST actually released Special Publication 800-207 in its final revision in August of this year. So both of these are excellent resources as you're thinking and learning about Zero Trust, but be aware that they don't completely agree on terminology or some of the core concepts, which I think actually is a good segue into some of those key concepts. I'm sure we all know this one, naturally. I think when it comes to Zero Trust, the thing we can say in its most basic sense is we need to trust but verify. And I think most of us would agree that in our typical IT operations, we trust and we sometimes verify. The example I like to give is one of these. I'm sure back when we could all get together to actually participate in team building events together, we all had an opportunity to do this. For those of you that have not seen one before, this is known as a trust wall. And I want to emphasize here the blindfold, that is, someone doesn't know what's going on, but they are trusting, that is, based on the context, that their coworkers will catch them. And as the Jericho Forum informs us, we should definitely assume context at our peril. So if we were to rephrase the old Russian proverb, we'd say verify, then trust, then verify again. Or as NIST SP 800-207 says, what we're really trying to do is minimize uncertainty in enforcing accurate, least privilege per request access decisions. Another thing to think about is that as we think about those access control decisions, we have some new access control subjects. We're all accustomed to using users, but as we look at Zero Trust, we also want to incorporate both the endpoints and the user agents or applications that folks are using. So it's worth maybe talking a little bit about why being able to authenticate and authorize applications matters. And I'll use the example of browser extensions. So what you see here is a Chrome window. I went to the Chrome store. I picked productivity as the category that I wanted. And so I recognize some of these applications and some of them I don't. And when I click through and look at the larger list of productivity extensions that are available for Chrome, it gets to be kind of a very weird mismatch of items out there. And the risk here is unintended exfiltration, right? Browsers and browser extensions have a lot of power. They can access enterprise data. And the issue with extensions is even though they go through some form of vetting process, they may be of questionable provenance. Really confront the same issue when you deal with things like mobile applications as well. So the Zero Trust Networking's book and the NIST special publication have pillars and tenets respectively. I've tried to distill them down into a single list, but when it comes to the key characteristics, what we're really talking about here is there's no distinction in a Zero Trust network between a trusted and an untrusted zone. You should always assume that there is some level of compromise on the network. And importantly, location is never a proxy for identity or trustworthiness. And that's a thing that we've relied on in network security for a long, long time, that if a thing is in a particular place, it probably is relatively safe. And Zero Trust tells us that's not true, or that we shouldn't approach things from that point of view anymore. Another key point is that everything is subject to authentication and authorization. You can see that in the second bullet point there. And that the access decisions that we make have to go beyond static credentials. So Zero Trust is really helping us protect against a couple of different things. The first is credential abuse. When you combine strong user authentication, I know that's been a recurring theme throughout the sessions, both yesterday and today. With device and user and agent authentication, you can prevent attackers from using compromised credentials in any meaningful way. And then it also helps protect against lateral movement, because when you can segment your network, then you have the opportunity to complicate attacker reconnaissance efforts, limit their pivot points, and also hopefully prevent the spread of malware. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about the zero trust architecture and components. You can divide things really into three big buckets. The first is the control plane, which is really where the decisions get made. You've got the data plane, which is really where everything happens. And in Zero Trust Networks, the Gilman and Barth book, there's also this notion of the agent. And they describe that as an ephemeral authorization component, which contains information about all the participants in an access request. So in a typical scenario, what we're thinking about most of the time is the user. But what the agent does is actually wrap up everything. So not just the user, but the device, the application, and the session or flow. And so this is usually the keeper of the trust score. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. You can also kind of divide components in a zero trust network into a couple of other sub-buckets. The first is a policy decision point, which is really any entity that defines or evaluates policies, including the actions. Policy information point, as the name implies, is anything that provides info back to the PDP. And lastly, the policy enforcement point is the thing that establishes, monitors, and terminates network connections or other access to resources. NIST has a slightly different view of this. They break the policy decision point into two subcomponents, the policy engine and the policy admin. The policy engine is the thing that actually makes the decisions, and the policy admin is the thing that is responsible for carrying out the decisions. They also don't officially define the policy information point in the document that they produced, but you'll see they do make some reference to it up here in a couple of slides. So when we look at the relationship of the different components, we've got the policy decision points, getting information from the agent, as well as the policy information points, and feeding all of that back to the policy enforcement point so it can make appropriate access control decisions. Borrowing from the, and it's also important to point out that PIPs and PEPs may actually overlap. So when you learn something about an enforcement through the enforcement point, you may want to feed that back as information and context that's relevant for subsequent access decisions. So NIST has, as I said, a slightly different view of these. If you looked at these two things side by side, you'd see most of them line up, but you'll note in this diagram that some of the things that it references that are policy information points are systems, and some of them are ideas, and so they take a slightly different approach to it. One quick note that NIST also defines something called trust algorithms. Those can be criteria or score-based. Criteria is simply just a way of checking a bunch of boxes. And score-based is something that does a little more weighting of individual attributes. Those can also be singular or contextual. That is, singular is we treat each request individually. Contextual takes into account some user history. I think in a typical implementation, criteria-based and singular requests are usually the easiest to implement out of the gate. So taking a quick look at high-level implementation as we come in on the home stretch, I want to underscore that this work is not necessarily glamorous, but it's not impossible either. You heard yesterday in Jeremiah Grossman's panel and in other sessions, I'm sure, that you have to strengthen your authentication regime. It's one of the simplest things to do. It pays massive dividends in helping to sort of get you started on the zero trust journey. You also, and this is where the work gets a little tough, need to create a complete inventory of endpoints and services. And that sounds probably daunting, but there are some things out there that can help you. One of them is network access control, because it can help you answer questions like, do I know enough about them right now to grant them access? And when it comes to finding out about services, you can answer questions like, you can use firewalls and proxies to answer questions like, which endpoints are communicating with which services, if those services are secure, and if there are any unknown services. Next, you've got to think about what your access conditions are going to be or your authorization rules. And I would urge you here to also carefully consider your threat model. And I'm going to take a quick detour on threat models as well. Last year, both Kanye West and Congressman Lance Goodman came under fire because they got photographs punching their passcodes into their phones. And we know that those passcodes are weak, but the interesting thing about that is that the passcode of a phone is something that is only locally significant. And so I would challenge anyone to see how close they could get to either Kanye West or Congressman Goodman before they encountered their security detail and were removed handily. So while the passcodes are bad, the threat model is such that it doesn't really matter that that's the case. And sometimes it's worth taking a step back and kind of reevaluating some of our common assumptions about things to make sure we're focused on the right problems. So the next point is that you really need to decide what context you need to safely grant particular levels of access, and that feeds back into your authorization rules. And I want to emphasize here that any policy without an enforcement mechanism is really just a recommendation. And then lastly, you got to figure out where you're going to get this context from by identifying your PDPs, PEPs, and PIPs. As you search for those things, it's a good idea for a PDP to select systems that can aggregate information and have the ability to program other systems. Policy information points are systems that contain the most relevant information for authentication and authorization. And then for policy enforcement points, you're going to need things that can actually receive instructions from external sources. So that implies some sort of programmability or API. When it comes to getting more context, good places to look are your directories or your ID governance and admin, because they hold attributes and can help you support your privilege management requirements. Asset management gives you systems of records for legitimate assets and baseline configurations. And then things like endpoint protection can give you better details about the real-time data or better real-time data on the health and status of particular endpoints. So in conclusion, this is not a forklift upgrade. Chances are you already have a lot of the building blocks that you need to be successful with Zero Trust. Reference documents are super helpful, but sometimes they represent some components as monoliths, and in practice they won't be, so you may have some integration work to do there. I also want to just put some thinking about your threat model and where you need to get more context for authentication and authorization decisions. And finally, keep in mind that this is, like all things in security, it's a journey, not a destination. So once you start, just keep going. And a couple of things on recommended reading. Just check out the Jericho Forum commandments. Definitely give the Google Beyond Corp white papers a look. Take a look at the NIST special publication. And if you have the time to plow into Zero Trust Networks by Gilman and Barth, I definitely recommend that as well. And with that, we have come to the end.
All right, James, thank you. And I have at least 2 questions for you. So let's use the remainder of our time wisely. Yes. Okay, first question from the audience. Second question will be my personal question. So here's the audience question. What are the most important systems for which you should implement Zero Trust?
That's a tricky one because I think that's going to vary by environment. So as a general rule of thumb, I would say those things that are most exposed. I would also encourage you to take a look at NIST Special Publication 800-207 because they have a number of interesting use cases articulated there. And the use cases in that document can provide some useful reference points for how to think about which systems to do this with first.
Got it. Got it. My question is, and I mentioned this earlier this morning, so I really want to get your take on this, but you know, COVID obviously has shifted the workplace to the home, and there's devices in the home that weren't built for the office, namely voice activated things like Google Home and Alexa. And so, you know, in your presentation, you had a section when you're identifying unknown services in your approach to implementing Zero Trust. And, you know, there are documented cases where people aren't even saying the voice activated word and their conversations are being recorded to the cloud. So, do you see at some point, or is it even currently a best practice where, hey, if you're director level and above, hey, no Alexas at your house? I mean, is Alexa zero, like this to me is, what, and then what if the bad actors hack into Amazon's cloud to download your recordings or what? I don't know. There's a lot of unknowns around these devices.
Yeah, that one gets difficult both from just a purely policy level. That is, as an organization, can you tell your employees you're not allowed to have Amazon Alexa in your house? And so that can be tricky. I think, thankfully, there are certain things, at least with regard to zero trust. A lot of people think that means that VPNs are going away. And while it probably means certain types of VPNs are changing the way they operate, in reality, there's still an expectation that all traffic will ultimately be encrypted. And so you have the benefit, at least in a distributed environment, where you can implement some protections from snooping snooping by other network devices. But that is definitely something that organizations will have to figure out how they are going to approach, because, as I say, it's probably pretty difficult to say you're not allowed to have a digital assistant in your home, though there might be a perfectly good case for that. I know some organizations, for example, that disable Siri on their company-issued iPhones. And so some of that is going to come down to what your risk tolerance is and what you think might happen. But I think if you implement zero trust principles effectively, even if you're working on a frankly hostile network, there are protections that you can put in place on company-owned assets to protect them.
Thank you, James. Another audience question here. You mentioned there are a lot of building blocks of zero trust companies probably already have. Not quite sure about the sentence structure. What might some companies overlook?
Well, I think I would actually say that probably the thing that folks are most likely to overlook is things like asset management databases and configuration management databases. We typically think of those things as plumbing to sort of keep the lights on in IT. But if those things are up to date, there's actually a lot of valuable information in there, about things like OS versions, software versions, attributes of endpoints and software packages that you might want to factor into authorization decisions. And so, some of the very boring things that we have done for a long, long time, I think start to get much more useful in a security context. And so I would strongly encourage folks to, as they're thinking through these things, and often we don't normally consider them to have a huge role in security other than sort of keeping track of assets. But think about how you can repurpose those things to give you more relevant context information as you're making authorization decisions.
Yeah, James, that's a nice link between our comments by Jeremiah Grossman during yesterday's keynote. His startup BitDiscovery, as we know, is basically indexing the assets of the internet, and he had broken it down by major healthcare players. And some of the content he shared yesterday, I'd never seen anywhere else. But yeah, when we talk about expired SSL certs, I mean, some of these providers, it was in the hundreds. Another interesting slide I saw when it came to asset management database inventory is, these American healthcare companies having servers or instances in dozens or more countries. I just never thought that. Now, I don't know if that's production or development, but I do think that's spot on. The asset management is largely undiscovered and very enthusiastic for his startup, because I don't think enough people are talking about that.
Yeah,
so thank you.
Definitely not the flashiest work, but it's work worth doing for sure.
Yeah, and I don't even know how he got some of that data. I mean, geez. but really neat to see for sure. So James, we are coming up at the end of our time slot here. I want to thank you for sharing your time with us, educating our users, our audience members, customers, and prospects. I think if you've got 50 to 1,000 employees and you're an IT director, I mean, zero trust is, yeah, maybe it's a buzzword, but it's something that you need to be aware of, if not implementing. And I could say during our high trust journey, we were forced to become intimately aware of these concepts. So it's definitely applicable. So James, I want to thank you for your time and thanks for being with us
Thank
at
you.
Podbox Secure at Home.
It was my
Take it
pleasure.
easy.
Take care.
Bye-bye.